Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another in the Algorithm webinar series. Today's topic is budget building, and we're actually going to be taking a close look at applying strategic management to the budgeting process. My name is Jeff Jenkins. I'm an Algorithm account manager, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session. Our presenter today is our own Dennis Easter, and Dennis is one of our Profix consultants who has been focused quite a bit lately on budgeting within Profix and the way that our users can use Profix regardless of their ERP system or other data source in order to create and manage their budgeting process. Now, a couple of housekeeping details before we get started with Dennis's presentation. We are recording today's presentation, and we will share the recording after today's session. We do have a slight delay once we get the recording from WebEx and we're able to convert it for publication on our YouTube channel. So that will be available to all attendees. And then also I want to mention to you that all of our attendee phone lines are muted as you come into the webinar. It's simply to minimize the ambient noise in the background. However, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And because of having the phone lines muted, what we're doing is you can submit your questions at any point during the webinar in either the chat or the Q&A windows in WebEx, and then we'll go ahead and collect those questions and we'll make sure that we address them during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any difficulties either hearing or seeing the presentation, please also let me know through the chat window so that we can help you get connected properly so that you can enjoy the webinar. And with that said, I think I've taken care of all the housekeeping details. And so at this point, Dennis, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you. Dennis?
Thank you very much, Jeff. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon, folks. It's about a really riveting topic, budgeting. All kinds of things come to people's mind when we start talking budgeting. Good times, sunshine and butterflies usually aren't among them. But what we really want to do today is focus on how you can apply some project management principles to the budgeting process in order to maximize its efficiency and make it as painless as possible. As we look at the budgeting process, there are really several things that we have to deal with as we're constructing budgets and forecasts for organizations. The first is control. Most companies that I've worked with in the past will use an Excel model for their budgeting. They'll be distributing spreadsheets with account numbers and budget lines to the different department heads and budget managers, and they'll fill them out and then return them, and then they go through the tedious task of merging that data together. And users tend to help because they feel like they can, and will introduce errors and formatting issues to the budgeting worksheet that then makes the data merge impossible in that format, and so you have to go back and revise. So control is a big issue. The tools, like I said, Excel is often used, and sometimes we reach beyond Excel's capabilities. Another one of the issues that I've worked with in the past and faced as we've built budgets is active engagement among the people providing the data for the budget. And one of those frustrations that keep people from being actively engaged has to do with the effectiveness of the tools. Another one is the fact that they often see the budget as a hammer. You know, it's a necessary evil that they go through every year, and it's painful, and then the only thing that they ever see the budget used for is to ask them to justify expenses throughout the year. And so the engagement is low, and pressing deadlines also cause people not to be as engaged in the process. While they might participate, their engagement is lower because along with all the other things they have to do, they got a budget that now they have to construct, which only leads to additional stress in their lives. So as we look at trying to overcome some of those challenges and issues facing the budget process, what we want to look at is, you know, what makes a good process, and then how we can apply project management to it. And the first of all, you know, just as the key issue facing budgeting, you know, the key to a good process is control. I'm an accountant by trade, and understand the value of a good control environment. But controls with this aren't simply for error checking and verification, but it also is for helping define the process. You know, so a controlled process, define the roles and whose role it is and whose responsibility it is to create the data for the budget, and then is there a level of review and approval that needs to be assigned as well. And so by establishing what your control points are with the budget, you're able to better define the process because you've defined your actors. Another type of control is, you know, what is an acceptable range of operations? Okay, so what are the expectations for your end users as they're building their budget? Are they allowed to provide a significant increase in expenses? And if so, the process needs to understand that and include validation checks for that and justification. You know, another part of the process for budgeting are the assumptions that you're going to use, and that is what part of the budget is implied. This will get into developing your templates. So are you going to start with previous year or current year actuals plus a remainder year for forecast as your starting point? Are you going to increase that by a percentage? And so what assumptions are you going to include in your process? Another key to the budget process is the inputs themselves. You know, inputs at each task supplied by the different parties will determine the effectiveness and the controls of the budget construction, and then allow you to substantiate and validate the process as well. But one of the things that you have to do inside the process is that you've got to have valid outputs. You've got to have predefined outputs so that you can build your input, your assumptions, and your calculations in order to define those, in order to have those properly designed and guide the input in the process themselves. As we start to look at the project management in applying it to the budgeting, we'll do the Project Management 101, where really you have the project management triangle. You have your time, the scope, and your costs. And your costs we're going to associate with the resources that you work with. And so the first resource that you're going to work with, and you have to have engaged in your budget process, are your employees. So as you're building your process, you have to take into consideration who the employees are that are going to be providing the information for you. So what type of knowledge do they have for constructing a budget? Do they have any experience preparing a budget or working in a collaborative team effort? What are their technical skills? Can they function and navigate within the Excel spreadsheets that you're using, or within the software model that you've built in order to construct a budget? What's their organizational knowledge? What do they know about your company? If you've got a new employee that may not understand the communication channels, both formal and informal in the organization, it may affect their ability to contribute. And then especially when it comes to building a financial budget, what is their financial acumen? So do they understand the relationship between business operations? Where they may be able to, for example, get a lower purchase price by purchasing a higher quantity, but because that higher purchase quantity stays on the shelves longer and impacts your cash flow, do they understand those basic relationships so that they're considering that as they build the budget as part of the process? The second resource that's important to consider as you're building your budget process are the tools that you have. And what makes the tools effective is, one, are they easily accessible and user-friendly, to use a software term. And while Excel may certainly fall into the category of being user-friendly and familiar and easily accessible, one of the problems with Excel tends to be, is it controlled? And this is not just has to do with the software itself, but also how are the workbooks managed? Are you saving them out onto a network folder? Okay, and if you're doing that, what type of protection do you have to keep your templates from being overwritten, from someone opening up templates to view data that they shouldn't be seeing? What type of controls do you have in place? Particularly when we talk about the budgeting tools as well, is the best ones are integrated with your financial reporting package. It makes for efficient transfer of data, and it also provides an environment for easy updates and comparison. And one of the key points about your tools that you have is that it should be easy to analyze the process and track the process as well. You can have spreadsheet templates for everyone, but then how do you know if they're completing them? How do you know the progress that they're making on developing their input for the process? And so being able to measure progress and analyze the project becomes important. It's an important aspect of the tool that's often overlooked, and that's usually because we don't know what else to do, and we've always done it this way, and so we understand that my Excel spreadsheet tracking the progress of everybody else's Excel spreadsheet becomes the norm. And one of the things, as we talked about the resources, then we also need to keep the scope in mind as we look at the project. And as you start thinking about your budget preparation, one of the things that I often ask people is, are you budgeting to the proper level? Are you providing enough information for management to be able to carry out their objectives and to measure those, or are you providing too much detail? One of the things that I often ask is, really, what is the significance of budgeting at an individual account line for office supplies? Okay. For some, I see that you don't want to budget every single line, but when you think of the way that businesses operate and how you're budgeting administrative expenses, okay, for some departments, office supplies, travel and meals, copy machines. You can go down the list of individual general ledger accounts that you have, and you can ask yourself, really, what is the value other than a spending constraint do I want to put on that particular general ledger account? Would it be better and more efficient and more effective to budget at a cost group level? So I have my administrative expenses, and you can decide what accounts go in there. Because if you have a variance in office supplies, what is the real value? What is the material impact of overspending $50 for a month on office supplies for most companies? And so this is where we start to determine what's the best level to budget out, because too much information is as bad as not having enough information. It plugs up the process, and gives you more details to wade through with very little value. And one of the things that you should keep in mind as you're building, and considering the scope is, what's the objective of the budget? If you're building, a high-level organizational budget, then individual line items for general ledger accounts really aren't relevant. However, if you're building operational plans, then they require more detail. And so as you're building the operational plans, whether you're building operational plans and aggregating them in a bottom-up fashion, or you're presenting higher level plans and then getting more granular and detailed as you go down in a top-down process, you've got to decide to make sure that the level of detail you're providing supports the budget objectives and assumptions. And another thing to consider when you're looking at that as well is, how are you going to budget allocated accounts? Okay, how are you going to manage allocated accounts in your budget analysis variation, and then also accountability for spending? Those are some of the things that, as you're keeping the objectives of your budget in mind, to also consider to make sure that your process is lining up with the objective. The second part of developing the scope is is risk management. And everything has risk. Risk is just a level of uncertainty. And so as you're going through and you're looking at the resources that you're dealing with, you're looking at the information and the tools available to you, you have to identify the risks that you're going to be dealing with, and then establish the proper controls. And by doing that, you're going to have a better ability to control your scope and manage your scope. So it shows, what can happen is, if you start to look at extreme detail in your budgeting process, you can become overwhelmed, if you will, with the pure volume of numbers. And really, you can have what's the value of what you're getting. Okay. The third leg of the process manager, project management triangle, is time. It's what time is available to complete the project. And so as we look at the various components of the project, these are all things that need to be considered as you're developing the timeline. And I do hope that as you're starting your budgeting process, you develop a detailed work plan for each step along the process, so that as you're building the tasks, you can also add in the controls and assign the resources and tools to each step. And so the first part of the budget preparation project is obviously, it's the preparation. It's reviewing the previous budgets and getting an idea of what was that process like, how accurate was the outcome when you compared it to actual. So go ahead and do your calculations of what your mean absolute deviation was, to find out how close you were, because that can give you an idea of really the value of the budget. If you can identify the differences and then identify the causes of the differences, then you can build those controls into the new process. As you're preparing the next step is building your templates. And that's where you decide what information is your team going to start with. Are you going to prepare a current year 9+3 forecast and give them a business as usual type starting point? Excuse me. Are you going to use current year and then increase it by a percentage or decrease it by a percentage? Are you going to use a zero-based budget where they have a blank template and they put in their values, and then as you aggregate them, you go through the justification process. And then one of the keys in the preparation is developing the KPIs for your individual business units. What are your targets, so that as you're going through the process, you have a measurement that you can apply against each one of the individual business unit submissions in order to find out whether or not it's lining up with the overall goal. So preparing to actually engage the users can actually be a fairly significant effort, depending upon the success that you've had in the past. Another part of the preparation before you actually put something in front of the users is the training, because you may have new participants in the budgeting process that you need to engage with and work with. And it's always good for existing people, returning people, to go ahead and have a refresher. That way, brings them back into focus about how the process happens. Okay. Then you get into the actually, input, review, and adjust cycle, and hopefully, if you've given them a good starting point and you've developed the KPIs, you can minimize the cycles that this has to go through. And then after you have got the adjustments and you feel good about it, excuse me, there's often an approval process that needs to be done as well. And that is presenting to, it may be a board of directors that then has to, you do the budget presentation and finalize the budget to move on. Some of the keys to a successful budget process execution are really simple if you think about everyday life. First one is communication. What's going on? And if you make your communication event-driven, so if you have a system or solution in place where people are communicated with and they're informed of deadlines or upcoming events that they need to participate in, then that minimizes the risk of communication fatigue. Hey, just checking in to see how things are going. Remind you what templates do. If you overwhelm people with communication, then it can start to be ignored or taken lightly. Whereas if they know that it's going to be event-based, so that it's relevant and tied back to the project, then it's much more effective. Second key to good execution is accountability. Okay, and that's where you develop your process and your controls, but you have to hold the people accountable to the same standards. And being able to manage the process, so you're tracking their progress, you're tracking the accuracy of their inputs, and you're taking measurements, if you will, of people's participation, then you can go ahead and you can hold them accountable. And that's one of the things that people want to know about in their job is, what is my job and how am I being measured for success? And that gives them a framework to operate within. And then the last key to good execution is measurement, because you've heard that you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you do have your strategic plan interlaced and integrated with your budgeting process, then it's easy to measure your budget against your strategic plan. Okay, is it, by quantifying your strategic objectives and comparing them to your budget plan, you're able to build upon and correlate the two. Okay, are your budgets tied to value drivers? So instead of requiring data inputs for each line, are you able to base the number of personnel needed on the production floor on units produced? And can you calculate that and develop your budgeting process using the drivers in order to get a closer correlation to the actual operations? And then are the measurements, another way to apply the measurements is taking the budget information in order to support analysis throughout the year. Okay, and so it's an ongoing look at the budget of how are you able to apply the budgeting process and the budgeting results to operations in order to create effective operational planning and adjust it throughout the year. So we do have just a few minutes left before the Q&A session. So what I do want to do is I want to take just a brief moment and show you the Profix system that Jeff had mentioned earlier. It's a CPM system, corporate performance management, that integrates your budgeting, financial reporting, and consolidations, planning and analysis into a single source of data, a single source of truth that can be used to manage the operations throughout the year. And, you know, as we talked about the budgeting process, you know, we talked about giving you a controlled input system. And here you have, instead of an Excel spreadsheet, you know, Profix gives you a very Excel-looking template. And this would be an operating expense template that is distributed to users based upon their role and position within the company. And within the template, you know, here we can look at the 2018. This is going to be the 2018 budget. And so we're going to go ahead and say that for the year, we're going to have $60,000 in office expenses, and it allows me to choose how I want to spread the data. And so I can spread it evenly, I can spread it based upon the existing data, but this is where we started talking about using different drivers, is I can actually choose other information in whether it's a production quantity account in order to calculate and spread the data to make sure that I'm accounting for seasonality and such. So I'm just going to go ahead and spread it on the existing data, and now it's updated each one of the months according to data that was always already there. So if you're starting with a 9+3 or 10+2 current plus budget forecast, it'll build in the seasonality that you've expected. And one of the things about the template is that it's tied to a budget version, and the budget version is automatically updated as soon as the data is input into the template. With the templates that we provide in Profix and you can build is that you can have your monthly income statement, and within the monthly income statement you can build it in such a way so that you can look at actual data, and you can use the same format for your budget data. You don't have to recreate forms or such, but it really affects a great presentation tool by being able to format and present your budget in the same way that you do your other operating system. We're running close to the time for the Q&A, so I'll just briefly touch on the fact that we can set up individual workflow tasks that manage the budget process so that you can keep people accountable to the deadlines in order to complete the project on time. And if you're interested in bringing more control to your budget process, certainly let us know. We'll be more than happy to do an assessment of your current process and find out whether or not there's a place for you to gain efficiency, whether it's through profits, whether it's through other products, or whether it's simply through applying project management to your budgeting process. So, Jeff, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Well, thanks, Dennis. And actually, this was a very interesting conversation, despite your preparatory comment about budgeting being less than a riveting type of discussion. And actually, we've got a couple of questions already that I wanted to just throw at you. One was specifically a comment that you made about knowing your resources. And the question came up, how frequently are your expectations about what your resource capabilities are off in terms of you're asking resources to do things that they either don't have the skills or knowledge to do, or they're not prepared, properly informed of what the expectations are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'll give it a stab, and if we need clarification, we can sure cover that. In order to really get a handle on people's technical abilities, okay, that's where communication throughout the workplace is so important to get to know who you're working with. And so if you're the CFO or the controller, then my hope would be that your organization would have the communication channels so that as you're working with people on the same level of the organization on a regular basis, that you're getting to know them, and they in turn get to understand requirements of the people that report to them. And so if you're talking to the VP of operations, and he's going to have his warehouse manager and his transportation manager, his production manager fill out their budgeting templates, he really needs to have an idea of their technical expertise and be investing in them and training them in order to make sure that they're capable to do those jobs. So I hope that answers the question.
It does, Dennis. And actually, the question, we got a follow-up clarification, was thinking specifically about department managers. So your answer really kind of hit on what they were getting at, was that there may be resources that are great at the specific job that they're required to do within an organization, but that resource participating in the budgeting process maybe is not either prepared appropriately, or the skill set isn't what's necessary, or the background and experience in the budgeting process isn't what is necessary. Then we've got another sort of a question. So let's pivot a second to assumptions. Because you talked about assumptions early on, Dennis. One of the questions came up that obviously when you are talking about the next year's budget, you're building in assumptions about growth rates, but how much of a factor should a business consider things like inflation rates and economic factors that are affecting the larger economy generally, not just the individual company?
Well, those are certainly key factors, and those type of planning elements really help determine or should be determining what the budgeting process looks like. You should it would be really a nice resource if every company had a full-time FP&A staff, so that as you're preparing the budget, they could develop those assumptions for you and do that analysis. And so that's where you look at what the key drivers to your business are. And so, if you've got a product that is very sensitive to economic changes, then that's where the people, if you're providing guidance for the sales team to develop the revenue forecast, then those are assumptions that you need to put before them as they're developing the forecast, so that they can then take that information, and you may want to do a couple different scenarios, maybe a best case, worst case, most likely, to where if you're looking at a range of inflation or a range of economic indicators that would affect your sales volume. And so you build those into your templates, and then as they're producing their input, you've given them guidance to consider what's going to be the effect of a slowdown, especially if you look at your customers' industries. How are your customers affected by economic slowdowns? And so those are assumptions that you then build into the model as you're providing guidance for the input.
And actually, I think this question ties in perfectly with some of our customers who are in economically sensitive areas, whether it's in the oil and gas industry or in the automotive industry, where perhaps the price of oil or the interest rate fluctuation may be impacting what their customers' ability to purchase more products would be. So that makes perfect sense. Now, Dennis, we got another kind of a different sort of a question, but a similar one. What do you recommend? How do you recommend dealing with unusual sorts of unexpected events that could impact your budget? And specifically, this person is referencing the tariffs that are affecting a number of businesses currently. Obviously, when businesses were doing their budgets for the 2018 year, presumably in 2017, there were no feelings of tariffs, being in the offing. But obviously, what's happened in the last few months is tariffs are now in place and affecting different industries in different ways. So is there a way that you would suggest handling those types of unexpected events or changes as far as your budgeting is concerned?
It's a great question. It opens up another discussion that we can just start briefly, and if anyone wants to continue it, then they can let us know or let me know, and we're more than happy to carry on with it. Anytime that a company is faced with an unexpected event that's going to have a material impact on their business, then I think that that's an immediate call for a reforecast. So, where you really have, for most companies in the calendar year, you've got nearly half a year left under these new economic conditions. And so that's where you bring the team back together and you say, okay, what's the impact on the business going to be? And what do we do? And so what's the rest of the year look like because of it? And, and I know that some companies are in the habit of reforecasting the year on a regular basis. A quarterly basis, they review things, and they may make an adjustment to their original plan. They may not. They may automatically adjust the plan if there's a significant variance in their actual to budget through the first or second quarter. But what I'd really like to propose people consider is start moving to a rolling budget, a rolling forecast. And so instead of budgeting for the fiscal year or the calendar year, and then doing it the one time in October to be effective in January, and then waiting until the next October, is to consider the benefit of a rolling forecast, a rolling budget, where you look at the current year plus 3 months. And then after the first quarter, you add 3 more months to the end of it. So instead of having your activity defined by a set period, okay, well, we know we're measured based on our fiscal year, your planning needs to extend past that. And by introducing the concept of a rolling budget, then you're able to keep the time frame for your planning close enough that you can still have a reasonable idea of what's going to be happening 12, 15 months from now, but you're not constraining yourself to the end of your fiscal period, because what happens then is you're really, you're planning for, the beginning of the next fiscal quarter 2 or 3 months before it happens, and in many cases, that's too late.
And actually, Dennis, your idea about the rolling forecast is another way that the budget, it's a living, breathing thing. It's not we're going to do our budget now, and once we've completed it, it's static and it doesn't change. Obviously, with a rolling budget, then that is going to not only capture some of those events like tariffs or whatever that happen, but it's also then going to allow the company to build into its rolling forecast variances or changes within their sales, for instance, or perhaps other types of changes, whether it's personnel or other types of things. Is that right?
No, that's exactly right. And so, and if we go back further and we tie this back to your strategic plan, then you're able to, really start to incorporate on a regular basis strategic initiatives instead of planning an entire year once and then hoping things fall out exactly as you planned.
Right. Right, and I don't know about you, but when I plan things, they rarely go as exactly as I planned them. So that also then obviously gives a company the flexibility to adapt their budget as they go through the year, right?
Correct, yes.
Right, okay, great. Now, I don't see any other questions right now, and I don't want to keep people here on the webinar waiting. If we have additional questions or if our attendees come up with additional questions, I want you to feel free to reach out to either your account manager here at Algorithm or anyone here on the sales team. You can reach out to us at salesteam@algorithminc.com or by calling 888-522-8588, and we'll direct you to your account manager so that we can carry on that conversation and answer any additional questions that you have. And one of the things I'd like to do, thinking about this as a rolling budget, is we're going to have some surplus at the end of this budget that we're going to give back to our attendees. So hopefully you'll be able to utilize that in the rest of your afternoon to catch up on things that you've gotten behind on. To wrap up, I want to again let everybody know that we have recorded this webinar and we are going to be publishing it on our YouTube site. You can come to the Algorithm Inc. website and there will be a link there where you can get access to the recording. Also, we will have additional webinars coming up in the coming weeks, so please pay attention to the invitations that are going to come out from our marketing team. And then lastly, I'd like to suggest that we would like to hear feedback from our attendees. There is a survey that will come up as you exit the WebEx presentation this afternoon, and if you have ideas or additional topics that you would like to recommend to us, we would love to to hear that feedback because we want to be as responsive as we can be to our audience's needs. And so if there are topics that we haven't covered or that are coming up in your business that you'd like for us to cover in this webinar series, then please do share that information with us, and we'll try to incorporate that in our planning for future webinars. With that said, I want to go ahead and thank everyone for attending this afternoon. We appreciate your time. Dennis, great presentation as always, thought-provoking. And again, we're trying to think outside the box here. We're not just showing you what software can do, but we're trying to revisit that whole idea of being a partner with you in your processes and evaluating those processes to try to help them be as efficient and as effective as they possibly can be. Again, Dennis, thank you, and we look forward to seeing all of our attendees during our next algorithm webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.